So why don't we start in the history here? You talk in the book about how Koreans felt at the time their country was divided, as if they were shrimp among whales, that they were being buffeted by the great powers around them. Can you talk a little bit about how we came to have a North and South Korea, who did that, and how they set these forces into motion?
Well, that's a good question because actually we did it. We divided the Korean peninsula. At the end of World War II, Korea had been occupied for 35 years by the Japanese, and nobody really knew what to do with it. Nobody knew much about it, but nobody in the U.S. knew much about it, what to do with it. There had been elaborate plans for the post-war occupation of Germany and Japan, but not Korea. And at the same time, there was, a great fear in Washington that the Soviet Union would be exerting its influence and that it might actually try to seize the entire Korean peninsula. So two State Department officers, one of whom was Dean Rusk, who later became Secretary of State, kind of huddled in a basement with a National Geographic map of the Korean peninsula and said, let's divide it. And the U.S. wanted to keep Seoul, the capital, the largest city in the southern district. And so they picked the 38th parallel rather arbitrarily. And this was really just a line on a map. Korea had never been divided in this way. In fact, regional divisions tended to run east-west, not north-south. And, of course, over time, this line hardened into, an impermeable demilitarized zone across the peninsula. But gradually, people who had been more left-wing, people who had fought the Japanese tended to move north. People with money, landlords, people who had worked in the Japanese occupation government tended to move south, and these populations became politically very different. But they were the same people, and just everybody had a relative heading to the other side. And it was infuriating to the Koreans because they had been occupied and they thought they were going to have their independence. And they also felt like, unlike the Germans who were divided because of their guilt, because they had been aggressors in World War II, the Koreans had been victims. They were divided because of their innocence. And it led to a poor us attitude, which I think is still very prevalent in both Koreas, especially North Korea. That's part of the reason they blame the United States for the predicament that they're in now.
Backing up before Donald Trump took office, North Korea was a top concern for President Obama, for President George W. Bush, for President Bill Clinton. And I have often struggled with the question of how much should America care if North Korea has a weapon and delivery capabilities? You often will read these stories of, North Korea might be developing a weapon that could reach Guam, that could reach Hawaii, that could reach the California coast. But obviously a lot of regimes have weapons that could reach America if they so chose. Is North Korea really an international threat? Are they really something that from an American perspective we should have so much fear and concern about?
Well, this is the great question, and I'm glad you asked it because, I almost, hesitate to say this, but this is a bit of a self-inflicted crisis. We are very far away from North Korea, and we don't really have, a lot of interest in North Korea. And, a lot of South Koreans believe, like, well, why doesn't, that the U.S. is the problem? Why don't we get out of the peninsula and, then we're not in the way, and that our whole presence there is counterproductive. And that view is very popular among young South Koreans. I lived in South Korea for more than 4 years. And, you think that South Koreans are, furious with North Korea and this and that. But if you go to a demonstration, an anti-North Korea demonstration in Seoul, there'll be like 50 old men who are Korean War veterans who will show up. But if you go to an anti-U.S. demonstration, of which I've been to many, you see, hundreds of thousands of people, these candlelight marches. There is, very much a view among a lot of Koreans that we are the problem.
Do you agree with that view?
Oh, you're going to get me in so much trouble. But I just see the emails I'm going to get. Yeah, kind of. I mean, I'm not saying we should just pull out of South Korea, but we are kind of the problem. And, I think almost any South Korean you talk to would say they're much more frightened of Donald Trump than they are of Kim Jong-un. The North Koreans are just doing what they always do. They're always threatening to turn Seoul into a sea of fire and unleash a thermonuclear war. And people in Seoul just shrug about it. And, I found this too when I was living in South Korea, that, nobody would be talking about this stuff. And then I would come home and people would start talking to me out is there going to be a war? Are you evacuating? Blah, blah, blah. They sort of, maybe they shrug too much, but they kind of shrug it off in South Korea because the North Koreans have been threatening for so long. I guess I'm going far afield now, but I don't believe that North Korea would launch an unprovoked attack on the United States. Maybe a provocation, which they've done before, where they're testing. They've certainly tested South Korea in that way. They've sunk a ship. They've shelled an island near the border. But they know that if they start a war with South Korea, which is double their size in population, it's the end of their country. It's the end of their system. And, more importantly for all those people in the elite, it's the end of their life of privilege. If they're not shot in the subsequent fighting, they're going to be at best refugees in South Korea or China.